Portland has never been kind to me. The dark clouds that hang over the city most of the year only intensified my feelings of loneliness after Hamish's death. Our house in the suburbs, which used to feel like a cozy nest, has now turned into a museum of memories, where every object reminds me of 52 years of life together. My name is Agatha Byrne. I am 74 years old, and I have spent the last 3 of those years as a widow. Hamish was a Portland police detective, and I was a criminal psychologist. We met on a high-profile case in 1971 when we were both young and full of energy. Hamish was skeptical about psychology, but my criminal profiles helped him solve that murder. Then there were many more cases, and over time skepticism gave way to respect and then love. Now all that remains of that life are Hamish's medals in a mahogany box and photographs on the mantelpiece. Our only daughter, Lila, became a successful lawyer, but our relationship has always been difficult. She thought I worked too much when she was growing up and that Hamish was too strict. Perhaps there was some truth in that. When you deal with criminals on a daily basis, it's hard not to bring some of that darkness home with you. Lila had inherited my stubbornness and work ethic, but not my insight into people. 6 years ago, she married Percival Harper, or Percy, as he preferred to be called. From day one, I was suspicious of this man. Call it professional deformation, but over the course of my career, I've learned to recognize certain personality types, and Percy fell into the category of people who are always looking for the easy way out. At first glance, he was charming, with a pleasant smile and the ability to hold a conversation on any topic. He worked for a software development company, something related to marketing and promotion. I never delved into the details because every time he started talking about his job, his eyes would wander, and the story would become either too convoluted or, conversely, suspiciously simple. The rain intensified as I drove up to their house in the western part of the city. A modern building with large windows and a minimalist design, completely unlike Hamish and my Victorian house. Lila invited me to dinner, which happened about once a month. Just often enough to maintain appearances, but not too often for genuine conversation. I took my umbrella out of my bag and slowly made my way to the front door. I was getting older, and my knees constantly reminded me of that, especially on rainy days. Before I could knock, the door swung open and Percy appeared on the threshold. "Agatha!" He smiled broadly, but I noticed the tension in the corners of his eyes. "How wonderful that you were able to come in this weather." "Good evening, Percy," I smiled back, watching him closely. A little rain never stopped me. He helped me take off my coat, a gesture that was meant to seem caring, but his hands were shaking slightly. "Lila is still cooking," he said, leading me into the living room. "Can I offer you something to drink? Perhaps some brandy to warm you up?" "Thank you, but I prefer tea," I replied, settling into an armchair. "Brandy is no longer for someone of my age." It was a small lie. In fact, I never drank in front of people I didn't completely trust. Hamish had taught me that early on in our working relationship. While Percy was busy in the kitchen, I looked around the living room. Everything looked immaculate, but somehow unnatural, like a stage set rather than a living space. Photos of Lila and Percy stood on the shelves, smiling faces against the backdrop of various tourist attractions. Not a single photo with me or Hamish. Lila came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mom, you're early," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact with a hint of reproach. "Hello, dear." I got up to hug her, but she took a step back. "I'm not done with dinner yet. Percy, did you offer Mom something to drink?" "Yes, I'm making tea," he replied from the kitchen. Lila looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes, and a wrinkle I hadn't noticed before had appeared on her forehead. Being a lawyer had always been stressful, but lately she seemed particularly exhausted. "How's your patent dispute case going?" I asked, trying to start a conversation. "It's dragging on," she replied curtly. "Listen, Mom, let's talk over dinner, okay? I need to finish the sauce." She went back to the kitchen, leaving me alone in the living room. A few minutes later, Percy returned with a cup of tea. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said, handing me the cup. "Lila's not in the best mood today. Work, you know." "Of course," I nodded, sipping my tea. It was too weak and too sweet, but I didn't comment. "Is everything okay at work, Percy?" His smile faltered slightly. "Yes, everything's fine. We've launched a new project. Very promising. I noticed him unconsciously touching his shirt collar, a gesture people often make when they're lying. Hamish called it tie syndrome. Sounds interesting. I decided not to press him. Can you tell me more about it? It's quite technical. He waved his hand. I don't think you'd be interested. You'd be surprised how much technical detail an old psychologist can absorb. I smiled, watching him shift in his chair. Fortunately for him, Lila called us to the table, saving us from having to continue the conversation. The dining room was decorated in the same minimalist style as the rest of the apartment. Dinner looked impressive: salmon with vegetables and some kind of exotic sauce. Lila always loved to experiment with cooking, although she rarely found the time to do so. It looks delicious, I said sincerely as I sat down at the table. I hope you like it, Lila replied, but her tone remained tense. We began to eat in silence. Percy tried to lighten the mood by talking about the latest TV series they had been watching, but the conversation didn't flow. I noticed Lila and Percy exchanging glances, as if having a silent conversation. So, Lila finally said, taking a sip of wine, I have some news. I need to go away for a few days. For work? I asked, watching her reaction. Yes, an urgent business trip to Seattle. One of our clients is in a difficult situation, and I need to be there in person. When are you leaving? I glanced at Percy, whose tension was almost palpable. Tomorrow morning. Lila put her glass down on the table. I'll be back in 3 or 4 days, depending on how things go. I understand, I nodded. I hope everything works out. Agatha, Percy suddenly spoke up. Lila and I were talking about this. Maybe I could stop by while she's away? To see if everything is all right? I looked at him with slight surprise. In all 6 years of their marriage, Percy had never shown such concern for my well-being. That's very kind of you, Percy, but I'm doing just fine on my own. Mrs. Caldwell, my neighbor, comes by almost every day. Still, he insisted. I would feel better if I could make sure you're all right. Maybe tomorrow evening? His insistence made me even more wary. I glanced at Lila, but she seemed lost in her own thoughts. If it will make you feel better, I said slowly, you can stop by. But give me a call first, okay? Of course, he smiled with obvious relief. I'll call before I come over. Dinner continued at the same tense pace. Lila talked a little about her upcoming trip, but without going into detail. Percy was unusually attentive, constantly refilling my tea and offering me seconds, which I politely declined. His behavior reminded me of suspects who become overly helpful when they feel they've been exposed. After dessert, an excellent cheesecake, which I suspected had been purchased rather than baked by Lila, we moved back to the living room. The conversation jumped from topic to topic, never lingering on anything long enough to become truly meaningful. How's your health, Mom? Lila asked when another pause occurred. Great for my age, I replied. The doctor says my heart is stronger than many 60-year-olds. That's good, she nodded, but I could see that her thoughts were far away. I decided to bring up a topic that had been bothering me for a long time. Lila, I've been thinking about making a new will. I'd like to know your opinion on a few things. Percy, who was drinking water at the moment, choked slightly. Lila glanced at him quickly before turning back to me. Mom, I don't think now is the right time for this conversation. When will be the right time? I asked. I'm 74 years old, dear. I'm not getting any younger. Just not today, okay? Her tone became irritated. I have an important trip tomorrow. I'm tired, and I still have to prepare some documents. I noticed how Percy relaxed after the change of subject. Of course, I said conciliatorily. We can discuss it when you get back. Shortly after that, I decided it was time to leave. Lila looked grateful when I announced my intention and only formally suggested that I stay a little longer. Percy volunteered to walk me to the taxi even though the rain had stopped. Thanks for the evening, he said as we waited for the car at the entrance. And don't worry, I'll take care of your house while Lila is away. That's very kind of you, I replied, looking at him intently. You know, Percy, you remind me of someone I worked with many years ago. He was also very caring, before doing something terrible. I said it lightly, as if sharing a funny memory, but I saw his face freeze for a moment before he forced a smile again. You and your psychological observations, Agatha. Lila always says you see criminals everywhere. Professional deformation, I shrugged. But you know what's interesting? I was rarely wrong. Fortunately for Percy, a taxi pulled up at that moment. He helped me into the car with exaggerated care. See you tomorrow, Agatha, he said, closing the door. Take care. You take care, Percy, I replied, watching him through the window. And especially take care of me. His smile faltered, and I saw a flash of fear in his eyes before the taxi pulled away. Driving home through Portland at night, I thought about the strange behavior of my son-in-law and daughter. Something was definitely going on in their lives, and I was almost certain that it didn't bode well. Years of working with criminals had taught me to recognize the signs of a storm brewing. The house greeted me with its usual silence. I turned on the light in the hallway and looked at the photo of Hamish standing on the dresser. "What do you think about this old man?" I asked my husband's image. "Our son-in-law is up to something, and I don't like it one bit." The photograph didn't answer, of course, but I could almost hear what Hamish would say. "Don't jump to conclusions, Agatha. Gather the facts, then act." I nodded, as if agreeing with this imaginary advice. Tomorrow Lila will leave and Percy will come to inspect my house. Well, I'll be ready for that inspection. Perhaps it's time to get the old jewelry box out of hiding and see how observant my caring brother-in-law really is. The morning was unusually clear for Portland. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, creating intricate patterns on my bedroom wall. I lay there watching the play of light and thinking about last night. Sleep had brought no rest. Too many questions swirled in my head. Percy's strange behavior bothered me. His sudden concern for my well-being, his nervousness, his exchanged glances with Lila, it all added up to a picture I didn't like at all. Over the years as a criminal psychologist, I had learned to trust my instincts, and right now they were screaming danger. I slowly got out of bed, feeling my joints ache. Old age is not the most pleasant state, especially when you have to deal with potential problems. Hamish often said that I would never stop seeing crimes where there were none, but too often it turned out that there were crimes after all. Going down to the kitchen, I brewed a strong black tea, the only habit I had retained from my active career. Looking out the window at the neighbor's yard, where Mrs. Caldwell was already tending to her roses, I suddenly remembered the box. The mahogany box, inlaid with mother of pearl, was a gift from Hamish on our 25th wedding anniversary. It held not only his medals and badges, but also the family jewels that Hamish's mother had given me shortly after our wedding, an antique pearl necklace, gold earrings with emeralds, and his grandmother's wedding ring with a large diamond. These pieces of jewelry had not so much material value, although it was considerable, as symbolic value. Hamish came from a family with a rich history, and every item in that box was part of his heritage. A heritage that was supposed to pass on to Lila, if she ever learned to appreciate family history. A sudden thought struck me. What if Percy knew about the box? What if his sudden interest in my house was related to it? I left my half-finished cup of tea and went upstairs to Hamish's study, which I had kept almost untouched since his death. The box was kept in a hiding place behind the bookcase, a place that only Hamish and I knew about, and perhaps Lila, if she remembered her childhood well. Pushing the heavy bookcase aside, it was getting harder and harder each time. I pressed a barely noticeable panel in the wall. The hiding place opened with a soft click. The box was there, covered with a thin layer of dust. I carefully took it out and held it up to the light, examining it closely. There were no signs of forced entry, and the lock was undamaged. Opening it with my key, I made sure that everything was still there. The medals, badges, and jewelry were just as I had left them last time. Relief mixed with anxiety. If Percy was really looking for the box, he hadn't found it yet. But his intention to visit me while Lila was away could only mean one thing. He planned to continue his search. And if he didn't know about the box, what else could have attracted his attention in his elderly mother-in-law's house? I put the box back in its hiding place, closed the panel, and struggled to push the wardrobe back against the wall. Then I sat down in Hamish's chair, trying to collect my thoughts. What did I really know about Percy? In the 6 years we had known each other, he had remained a mystery to me. A friendly smile without substance, a face without personality. Lila talked about his successes at work, his projects and promotions, but always in such general terms that I couldn't form a clear picture of his professional life. I remembered how surprisingly few guests from Percy's side had attended their wedding, only his parents, who were no longer young and clearly felt uncomfortable among Lila's colleagues, and a couple of friends who kept to themselves and disappeared immediately after the main ceremonies. No colleagues, no old friends. It was as if his life had begun the moment he met Lila. A phone call interrupted my thoughts. It was Lila. "Mom, are you awake?" Her voice sounded tense. "Of course, dear. It's almost 9 in the morning." I glanced at the antique clock on the wall. "Are you at the airport yet?" "Yes, boarding in 20 minutes. I just wanted to make sure you didn't mind if Percy stopped by tonight." "Don't worry about it." I tried to make my voice sound carefree. "Percy is always welcome." The pause on the other end of the line told me that Lila was surprised by my response. Over the years, I had never shown much enthusiasm for spending time with her husband. "Okay, that's good," she finally said. "He really cares about you. We both do." "That's very sweet of you," I replied, noting the strange intonation in her voice. "You don't need to worry. I'm doing just fine on my own." "Mom, I know you're independent, but you're 74 years old. You live alone in a big house, and I'm doing just fine," I repeated firmly. "Lila, you don't have to treat me like a helpless old woman. I'm still capable of taking care of myself." She sighed, a familiar sound of disappointment that I had heard from her since I was a teenager. "Okay, Mom, just be nice to Percy, okay? He's really trying." "I'm always nice to him," I said, knowing full well that wasn't entirely true. "Have a good trip, sweetie. Call me when you land in Seattle." "I will. I love you, Mom." "I love you too," I replied, surprised by this rare display of affection. After talking to Lila, my anxiety only increased. Something was definitely wrong, and I intended to find out what it was. But first, I needed to prepare for Percy's visit. I went down to the kitchen, made another cup of tea, and began to think about a plan of action. If Percy was really looking for the box, I needed to give him a chance to reveal himself, but without putting the valuables at risk. The solution came almost instantly. I had to create a decoy. In the pantry, I found an old craft box that looked similar to the one that held the family valuables. A few fake pieces of jewelry that I used at public events so as not to risk the real ones should look convincing enough to the untrained eye. I placed this bait in a desk drawer in the living room, obvious enough for Percy to find, but not so obvious as to arouse suspicion. Once I was ready, I called my old friend Edith, also the widow of a former police officer. We agreed to meet downtown for lunch and shopping, the usual routine for two elderly women. This gave me a reason to leave the house and allow Percy to inspect it in my absence. As I got ready to leave, I couldn't help but remember my early years with the Portland Police Department. Back then, I was the only female psychologist in the department, and I had to work twice as hard to prove my competence. The male detectives, including Hamish, initially viewed me with undisguised skepticism. "Psychology isn't science, it's guesswork dressed up in clever words," Hamish liked to say during our first cases together. But everything changed after the Riverside Strangler case, a serial killer who terrorized the city for several months. It was my psychological profile that helped narrow down the circle of suspects and ultimately catch the criminal. After that, Hamish became my most loyal supporter, and a year later, my husband. In 30 years of work, I have learned to recognize liars at first glance. People think that lies are hidden in words, but in fact they manifest themselves in the smallest details of behavior, in microexpressions that flash across the face for a fraction of a second, in the inconsistency between words and gestures, in unnatural pauses and inappropriate emotions. Percy was an interesting case. He lied easily, almost effortlessly, a sign that lying had become second nature to him. But even the most experienced liars have their anchors, physical manifestations that they cannot control. For Percy, that anchor was his shirt collar. He always touched it when he was telling a lie. And last night he was touching his collar constantly. Edith was waiting for me at the Margarita Cafe, a small, cozy place that we had grown fond of since our days on the police force. Despite being 72, Edith looked remarkably young. Fit, bright lipstick, and a sharp gaze that didn't miss a single detail. Agatha, she waved at me. I thought you changed your mind. Sorry I'm late. I sat down in the chair opposite her. It's been a eventful morning. Did something happen? Edith was always perceptive. Maybe, I nodded to the waitress, ordering my usual tea. Do you remember my brother-in-law, Percy? The slick guy who married your Lila? Of course I remember. Is he still trying to impress everyone with his successes in business? I smiled. Edith never minced words. That's the one. Yesterday he volunteered to look after me while Lila is away. Edith raised an eyebrow. Since when did he become such a caring son-in-law? That's what I'm wondering. I lowered my voice. I think he's looking for something in my house. Money, Edith suggested. Or something valuable? I have a box with Hamish's family jewels, quite valuable, and I never told Percy about them. But Lila might have mentioned it. She could have, I agreed. Although that's not like her. She's never been particularly interested in family history. Edith sipped her coffee, thinking about the situation. So what are you going to do? Call the police? On what grounds? I shook my head. My brother-in-law is too caring is unlikely to interest Sergeant Dawson. No, I've set a little trap. Let's see if our Percy takes the bait. We spent the next few hours having lunch and shopping. Edith tried to distract me with talk of her grandchildren and the latest town gossip, but my thoughts kept returning to the house and what Percy might be doing there. Around 3 o'clock, my phone rang. It was him. Agatha? His voice sounded too cheerful. I'm calling to see when I can stop by today. Oh, Percy. I tried to sound slightly confused. I completely forgot to tell you. I'm in town with a friend. We plan to have dinner together, so I'll be home quite late. The pause on the other end of the line was almost palpable. I understand, he finally said. Maybe tomorrow then? I have a book club meeting tomorrow. I relished his disappointment. But you know what? I have a spare key under the flower pot on the back porch. If you want, you can stop by today and check that everything is okay. Just don't forget to feed the cat if you come by. You have a cat? His voice sounded surprised. Of course, I smiled, knowing that I had never had any pets. A little calico. You probably haven't seen her. She usually hides from strangers. Of course I'll feed her, Percy said quickly. Thank you for your trust, Agatha. You're welcome, dear. And Percy, I paused. Be careful in my office. It's been such a mess lately. I won't touch anything, he assured me. I'll just check to see if everything is okay. After the call ended, Edith looked at me with admiration. Agatha Byrne, you're still in the game, she laughed. Just don't forget to feed the cat. Brilliant. We'll see how far he goes, I said, not quite as cheerfully. Despite my trap, the thought of Percy rummaging through my things was repulsive. Edith and I continued our day, but now I had a new plan. Instead of coming home late, as I had told Percy, I decided to catch him off guard. We finished our shopping trip early, and I asked Edith to drop me off at home around 6 in the evening. Are you sure it's safe? She asked as we approached my street. What if he's dangerous? Percy? I smiled. He's not the type to be violent. He's a manipulator, not a fighter. Be careful anyway, Edith insisted, and call me when you're done. If you don't call me in an hour, I'll call the police. I promised to be careful and got out of the car a block away from my house. The plan was simple. Approach from the back through Mrs. Caldwell's garden and catch Percy when he was busy searching. My heart was beating faster than usual as I carefully made my way across the neighbor's property. Mrs. Caldwell knew about my plan. I had called her before leaving the cafe and briefly explained the situation. She even offered to help, but I convinced her that I could handle it myself. As I approached the back of my house, I noticed Percy's car parked on the street, an inconspicuous silver sedan. So he was already inside. I carefully climbed the steps to the back porch, trying not to make any noise. As I expected, the door was unlocked. Entering the house, I froze, listening. At first it was quiet, but then I heard sounds of movement on the second floor, near my study. So the bait in the living room hadn't satisfied him. I quietly climbed the stairs, thanks to years of practice moving silently during operations with Hamish. On the second floor, the sounds became clearer. The rustling of papers, the sound of books being moved. Percy was clearly looking for something, and he was looking methodically. The The door to the study was ajar, and through the crack I saw him standing in front of the bookcase trying to move it. Behind that bookcase was the hiding place with the real box. Somehow, Percy had found out about it. I stepped back from the door and leaned against the wall, thinking about my next move. I could go in and catch him red-handed right now, but then what? He would surely come up with some explanation, and Lila would most likely believe him rather than me. No, I needed something more. Irrefutable evidence. And I had a plan to get it. I carefully climbed back down the stairs and left the house as quietly as I had entered. Getting into the taxi I had called before arriving at the house, I headed to the only place where I could get the help I needed. Returning home a little over an hour later, I was fully prepared to confront Percy. The plan was simple but effective. Those kinds of plans always worked best. I parked further down the street so he wouldn't hear the car approaching and called Edith to let her know that everything was going according to plan. As I approached the house, I noticed that Percy's car was still there. He had been in my house for over 2 hours, clearly not a typical visit from a caring son-in-law. This time I entered through the front door, making my presence known. "Percy?" I called, closing the door behind me. "Are you here?" The noise upstairs stopped abruptly, and then I heard hurried footsteps. Percy appeared on the stairs, his face expressing surprise, which he tried to mask with a welcoming smile. "Agatha, you're back earlier than I expected." "My meeting with my friend ended early," I smiled, taking off my coat. "Did you find the cat?" No." He blushed slightly. "I looked everywhere, but she must be hiding really well." "Oh, that little rascal." I shook my head. "She's always like that." "Well, thanks for stopping by, Percy. Is everything okay with the house?" "Yes, everything's fine." He began to descend the stairs. "I just checked the windows and doors. Everything's locked." "Including the study?" I watched his reaction closely. His hand twitched involuntarily toward his collar. "Yes, I just looked in there to make sure the window was closed." "How kind of you," I continued to smile. "You know, Percy, I've been thinking about our conversation today about the will. Maybe I really should reconsider it." His eyes flashed with interest for a moment before he put his mask of indifference back on. "That's entirely your decision, Agatha. But I'm sure Lila would be happy to discuss it with you when she returns." "Of course," I nodded. "But you know, there are things Lila doesn't know about. For example, the contents of a certain box." I noticed his gaze dart to the stairs and then back to me. At that moment, I knew I was right. He knew about the box and was actively looking for it. "What box?" he asked with feigned confusion. "Oh, you know which one." I lowered my voice to almost a whisper. "And you're not the first one trying to find it. But unlike the others, you have an advantage. I can just tell you where it is." His surprise was genuine. He clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. "I don't understand what you're talking about." "Percy," I interrupted him. "Let's not play these games. I know what you're looking for, and I know why. The question is how far you're willing to go." He was silent, assessing the situation. I could see various scenarios playing out in his head, denying everything, making up a story, trying to manipulate me. Finally, he chose the path of least resistance. "Agatha." His voice softened, almost confidential. "Perhaps we could come to a mutually beneficial agreement." "Perhaps," I nodded. "But first I want to know the truth. Why do you want the box? And how did you find out about it?" Percy swallowed, his hand reaching for his collar again. He was at a crossroads, and I could see it as clearly as I had once seen the hesitation of criminals in the interrogation room. Tell the truth or continue to lie, trust or resist. And as always, in moments like this, I felt a strange satisfaction. Despite my age, I could still corner a person with words alone. Hamish would have been proud. The morning began with heavy gray clouds hanging low over Portland. I woke up with a feeling of unease that had not left me since yesterday's conversation with Percy. Something told me that today would be the day when events would come to a head. After breakfast, I called Fred Donovan, Hamish's former colleague, who now worked as a private security guard. We hadn't spoken for about a year, but I knew I could count on his help. "Fred, I need your advice," I said after exchanging greetings. "It's about home security." "Has something happened, Agatha?" His voice sounded concerned. Not yet, but I can guess what's going to happen, I said, briefly outlining the situation, leaving out the details about my suspicions about Percy. I need to discreetly record anyone who goes through my things. Fred nodded understandingly. A miniature camera and an app for your phone. I can bring the equipment in an hour. Fred kept his promise. By noon, a hidden camera was installed in my office, disguised in the spine of one of the books, pointing directly at the bookcase with the hiding place. The app on my phone showed a clear picture and automatically started recording when it detected movement. This is the latest model, Fred explained as he showed me how the system worked. The battery lasts a week and everything is transmitted directly to your phone. Thanks, Fred, I said, sincerely grateful. I hope it's just my paranoia. Paranoia has helped us solve quite a few cases, he smiled, patting me on the shoulder. Call me if anything goes wrong. After he left, I carefully checked the hiding place and made sure that the real jewelry box was safely hidden. Then I prepared the bait, a box similar to the original, but containing only costume jewelry and a few inexpensive pieces. I placed it in a prominent place on one of the shelves. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Percy called. Agatha, I'd like to stop by today to check that window on the second floor. It looked a little loose. How nice of you, I said, trying to make my voice sound carefree. But I'm just about to go to the doctor for a checkup. I'll be gone from 3 to 5. Oh, I could stop by while you're out. His voice took on a note of excitement. I have a key, after all. That's a wonderful idea, I agreed. See you this evening, Percy. The plan was simple. I had to make it look like I was away, then sneak back and catch Percy red-handed. I arranged with Mrs. Caldwell, my neighbor, to leave my car in her garage and walk through her garden to my house. At 20 minutes past 3, I demonstratively left the house with my bag and documents, got into my car, and drove away. After driving a few blocks, I took a detour back to Mrs. Caldwell's house. Is everything ready, Agatha? She asked, meeting me at her garage. Yes, Martha, thank you for your help. I smiled gratefully. You're welcome, dear. It's the most interesting thing that's happened on our street since the Jenkins iguana ran away. We both laughed quietly. Martha walked me through her garden to the gate leading to my property. Percy's silver sedan was already parked near the house. I quietly approached the back door and silently unlocked it with a spare key. The house was quiet, but I could hear light footsteps upstairs. I checked my phone. The camera feed showed Percy in my office. He was methodically searching the bookshelves and desk drawers. My stealth skills, honed by years of police work, came in handy as never before. I climbed the stairs, pausing on each step to make sure it didn't creak. Reaching the second-floor landing, I stopped at the study door, which was slightly ajar. Percy had found the decoy box and was now fiddling with the lock, trying to open it with some kind of pick. After a few attempts, the lock gave way, and he opened the lid with obvious excitement. His face showed disappointment when he saw the contents, but he nevertheless began to carefully examine each piece of jewelry. I took out my phone and started filming. I needed to capture the moment of the theft. Percy didn't keep me waiting long. After selecting a few of the most valuable-looking items, a brooch with fake diamonds, a gold-plated ring, and a pair of Hamish's silver cufflinks, he glanced around and quickly slipped them into his jacket pocket. I continued filming, feeling the adrenaline pulsing through my veins. My intuition had not failed me. Percy really was a thief. Closing the box, he put it back on the shelf and continued to look around the room. His gaze fell on the bookcase that concealed the hiding place. He walked over to it and tried to move it, but the bookcase was too heavy. I took advantage of the moment to quietly move away from the door and go downstairs. Going out through the back door, I returned to Mrs. Caldwell and called Fred. Fred, he's here, I said. And he just stole some things from the box. I have it all on video. I'll be there in 15 minutes, he replied. Don't do anything stupid before I get there, Agatha. When I returned to the house 5 minutes later, I found that Percy had almost moved the bookcase away from the wall. A little more, and he would find the hiding place with the real treasures. I couldn't wait any longer. Taking a deep breath, I climbed the stairs, making no attempt to hide my presence. Hearing my footsteps, Percy froze, then frantically tried to push the bookcase back into place. I threw open the study door and stood in the doorway, staring straight at my brother-in-law. His face turned white with shock. Agatha, he stammered. I thought you were at the doctor's. Obviously, I walked into the room, not taking my eyes off him. What are you doing in my study, Percy? I was checking the window like I said. He pointed to the window at the far end of the room. It's stuck, and I... Stop lying. My voice was calm but firm. I saw you put the jewelry in your pocket. His hand twitched involuntarily toward his jacket pocket, a gesture tantamount to an admission. It's not what you think, he began. But I interrupted him. What do I think, Percy? I showed him the screen of my phone with the recording. I think I have a video of you putting my things in your pocket. How do you explain that? The shock on his face gave way to calculation. Agatha, let's talk like adults. His voice became soft and ingratiating. I can explain. I'm listening. I crossed my arms over my chest. Lila and I are having financial problems, he began. I lost my job 3 months ago and couldn't tell her. We're deep in debt. And you decided that stealing from me was a good solution? I raised an eyebrow. How original. At that moment, the doorbell rang. That must be Fred Donovan, Hamish's former colleague from the police, I said. He'll be very interested in our situation. Panic distorted Percy's face. Agatha, please! His voice became pleading. Don't do this. For Lila's sake. For Lila's sake? I smirked. Do you think she'll like finding out that her husband is a thief who steals from his own mother-in-law? The doorbell rang again, this time more insistently. If you don't want Fred to see you ransacking my house, here's what I suggest. I paused. You return everything you took right now. Then you go downstairs and explain to Fred that you came to check on me at Lila's request. After that, we'll discuss how you'll make amends. Percy immediately took the jewelry out of his pocket and put it on the table. Is that all? I asked, looking him in the eye. He nodded, unable to hold my gaze. Okay. I pointed to the door. Now go downstairs and meet Fred. I'll be there in a minute. When he left, I quickly checked the decoy box. Then I went downstairs, where Fred and Percy were standing in the hallway, Fred tense and suspicious, Percy pale and nervous. Agatha. Fred nodded at me. Your brother-in-law says he stopped by to see if you were all right. That's right, I smiled. Very thoughtful of him. Fred, would you help me with the bookcase upstairs? Percy tried to move it, but it's too heavy. Of course. Fred glanced suspiciously at Percy. With pleasure. Upstairs, I showed Fred the video and explained the situation. That's enough to make an arrest, he said after watching it. Do you want me to call the patrol? Not yet. I shook my head. First, I want to talk to him, to find out how deep he was in. Fred and I put the bookcase back in its place, hiding the stash, and went down to the living room where Percy was waiting. Sit down, I pointed to the sofa, and tell me the whole truth, from the beginning. Percy began to speak. The story turned out to be grim. Job loss, secret debts, gambling, loans from shady characters. They gave me 2 weeks to pay them back, he concluded. Otherwise they, threatened Lila. And you decided to steal from me to save your own skin, I summarized. I didn't know what else to do. He looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. I heard from Lila about the family jewels. And you thought I wouldn't notice they were missing? I shook my head. You're stupider than I thought. I understand that you can call the police. His voice trembled. You have evidence. Percy suddenly slid off the sofa onto his knees, his face contorted in desperate pleading. Please, Agatha! He was almost crying. Don't do this! For Lila's sake! She doesn't know anything about this. She doesn't deserve this shame. Lila deserves to know the truth about her husband, I replied harshly. I love her. He lowered his head. I really love her. I'm just confused. Confused enough to steal from her mother? I crossed my arms over my chest. That's an interesting form of love. Percy remained on his knees, his shoulders shaking with sobs. It was a pathetic sight, but I felt no compassion for him. I'll do anything you say, he finally said, looking up. Anything. Just don't tell Lila. Don't ruin our marriage. You ruined your marriage yourself when you decided to steal the family heirlooms, I snapped. But looking at this pathetic man, I realized that the situation was more complicated than just a thief and his victim. Layla loved him despite all his flaws, and my decision could destroy not only his life, but hers as well. Stand up, I finally said. I can't talk to someone who's crawling at my feet. Percy slowly got up, wiping his face with his sleeve. Here's what we'll do, I lowered my voice. I have conditions, and if you meet them, I might not go to the police. Hope lit up his face. Whatever you say, Agatha. Anything. Percy sat across from me, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the floor. Fred Donovan stood in the doorway, silently observing our conversation. So, I said, breaking the heavy silence, tell me the whole truth, Percy, and this time, no evasions or half-truths. How serious are your problems? Percy took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. It all started about a year ago, he said quietly without looking up. I made some bad investments, then tried to recoup my losses on the stock market. I lost almost all my savings. And you didn't tell Layla? I watched his reaction closely. I couldn't. He shook his head. She was always so proud of my successes. I didn't want to disappoint her. So you decided to lie. It was a statement, not a question. I thought I could fix everything. Percy finally looked at me. I took out a small loan, then another. I started playing poker. At first I was lucky, but then everything went downhill. I nodded. The story was painfully familiar. In my career, I had seen enough people in similar situations. It usually started with one lie, one rash decision, and then turned into an avalanche of problems. How much do you owe, Percy? He looked down again. $86,000. I couldn't help but gasp in surprise. The amount was enormous. And who do you owe that kind of money to? Percy swallowed nervously. Some unofficial creditors. You mean loan sharks? I asked sharply. Or worse, Robert Duran's people, he whispered. They have a reputation. That's complicated. Fred whistled softly. Robert Duran's name was well known in certain circles in Portland. Formerly, he owned several nightclubs, but behind the facade of legitimate business lay an extensive network of illegal operations. And these people threatened you? I leaned forward. How exactly? They said that if I didn't return the money within 2 weeks, they would... His voice faltered. They would make sure Lila found out the truth. And not just her. My parents, her colleagues, everyone. And if that didn't work, they would resort to more physical methods of persuasion. And you decided that stealing family heirlooms was a good solution to the problem? My voice sounded incredulous. I was desperate. Percy threw up his hands. I heard from Lila about an antique ring with a huge diamond, some valuable metals. I thought that if I sold them, I could at least partially pay off the debt and buy some time. And then what? I asked. Would you have stolen something else? Percy lowered his head, and his silence spoke louder than any answer. Agatha, Fred intervened, taking a step forward. You understand that this is no longer just a family drama, right? If Duran's people are involved, the situation could be dangerous. I nodded. Fred was right. This was beyond simple theft. We need to call Lyle, I said decisively. No! Percy jumped to his feet. Please don't! She can't know! She's your wife, Percy, I said firmly. And she has a right to know that her husband has not only lost all their savings, but also owes money to dangerous people. Not to mention that he tried to steal from her mother. I took out my phone and dialed Lila's number. The phone rang for a long time, and I was about to leave a message when she answered. Mom? Is something wrong? Her voice sounded tense, as if she were expecting bad news. Lila, I tried to speak calmly. You need to come here, right now. What happened? The alarm in her voice grew. Are you okay? I'm fine, I assured her. But there are things you need to know, and it's better if you hear them in person. Mom, I'm in Seattle at an important meeting. I can't just... Percy is here, I interrupted her, and he just tried to steal my jewelry. There was a long pause. I could almost physically feel Lila trying to process my words. Is this some kind of joke? She finally said. I wouldn't joke about something like this, I replied. I have video evidence and a witness. Another pause, then a deep sigh. Let me talk to him, Lila's voice became cold and businesslike, the tone she used in court. I handed the phone to Percy, who looked like he was about to throw up. Lila, I can explain, he began, but judging by his face, he was rudely interrupted on the other end of the line. He listened for several minutes, occasionally trying to say something, but each time he fell silent. Finally, he just nodded, as if forgetting that Lila couldn't see him. Yes, I understand. I'll wait. He handed me the phone back, his hand shaking. She's flying out on the next flight, he said quietly. She'll be here in 3 hours. Well, I took the phone. Then we have time to discuss how you're going to get out of this mess. Fred and I spent the next 2 hours discussing possible courses of action. Percy told us all the details of his financial problems, showed us threatening messages from creditors, and admitted that he hadn't been able to find a new job for over a month. The situation is serious, but not hopeless, Fred concluded after a long discussion. If you do the right thing, you can negotiate a debt restructuring with your creditors. But you'll need law enforcement too. People like that only understand force. I can't go to the police, Percy shook his head. They warned me. You have no choice, I cut him off. Either you take control of the situation, or it will take control of you. I've seen enough of these stories to know how they end. At that moment, the doorbell rang. We all exchanged surprised glances. Lila couldn't have arrived so quickly. Fred went to the window and peered out cautiously. It's a taxi, he reported, and a woman who looks like your daughter is getting out. I hurried to the door. Sure enough, Lila was standing on the doorstep, pale with a determined expression on her face, and her lips pressed into a thin line. I wasn't in Seattle, she said instead of greeting me. I was in Portland all this time. I stepped back silently, letting her into the house. Lila walked into the living room and stopped when she saw Percy and Fred, whom she didn't know. What's going on? She asked, looking from one to the other. Mom, you said Percy tried to steal your jewelry. Is that true? Lila, Percy got up from the couch and took a step toward her. Please, hear me out. I asked my mother a question, she replied coldly, without even looking at him. Yes, it's true, I approached my daughter. I have a video of him taking things from my jewelry box and putting them in his pocket, and he has already confessed. Lila closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to control her emotions. Show me the recording, she finally said. I took out my phone and played the video. Lila watched silently, her face expressionless. Only when the recording ended did she slowly sink into a chair. Why? The question was addressed to Percy, and he told her. Everything he had already told me, about lost investments, debts, creditors, and threats. With each word, Lila's face became more and more stony. 86,000, she repeated when he finished. You owed gangsters $86,000 and decided that the best solution was to steal from my mother? I didn't know what to do. Percy's voice trembled. I was desperate. You could have talked to me, Lila suddenly shouted, jumping to her feet. I'm your wife. We promised to be together in sickness and in health, remember? Or were those just words to you? I was afraid of disappointing you, Percy lowered his head. You were always so proud of my successes. And now I'm supposed to be proud that my husband is a thief? Her voice was dripping with venom. That you lied to me for months? That you put us in danger by borrowing money from criminals? I signaled to Fred, and we quietly left the room, leaving them alone. Some conversations should take place without witnesses. In the kitchen, Fred poured us both tea, and we sat in silence, interrupted only by muffled voices from the living room. Do you think they can handle this? Fred asked after a long pause. I shook my head. I don't know. Lila is strong, but this is a heavy blow. And Percy, I sighed. I'm not sure he's brave enough to fix this. Fred nodded in agreement with my assessment. Half an hour later, the kitchen door opened and Lila walked in. Her eyes were red from crying, but she stood up straight, with a dignity that always reminded me of her father. Percy left, she said, sitting down at the table. I told him I needed time to think. A wise decision, I approved. Mom, Lila looked at me with pain in her eyes. Why didn't you tell me earlier that you suspected him? You noticed something before today, right? I sighed. It was a difficult question. Yes, I had my suspicions, I admitted. But they were just suspicions without any proof. And you always defended him. Because I loved him, Lila said bitterly. And thought I knew him. Love often blinds us, I replied softly. Especially when it comes to people who know how to charm. How did you find out? Lila asked. What exactly made you suspicious? Many things, I said, pushing my cup of tea toward her. His nervousness at dinner yesterday, the way he suddenly took an interest in my well-being, his insistent desire to look inside the house while I was away, and of course, his anchor. Anchor? Lila looked puzzled. A gesture people make when they lie, I explained. For Percy, it's touching his collar. He did it every time he told a lie. Lila smiled faintly. Professional deformation, she said, repeating a phrase I often used. You've always seen right through people. Not always, I objected. Sometimes I was wrong, and sometimes I hesitated. Sometimes I saw what I wanted to see, especially when it came to people close to me. Our eyes met, and in that moment, understanding flashed between us. We both knew what I was talking about the years of coldness and alienation, about misunderstanding and unspoken resentment. I wasn't a good mother, Lila, I said quietly. I worked too much, spent too little time with you. I thought I was protecting you by keeping you away from the dark side of my work. But instead, I just kept you at a distance. Lila looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. And I wasn't an easy child, she admitted. I was always rebellious, always trying to prove that I was independent. And I often hurt you on purpose because I felt you were too far away. We both made mistakes. I reached across the table, and Lila, after a moment's hesitation, took my hand. When Dad died, she continued, squeezing my hand, I wanted to be closer to you, but I didn't know how. We had lived separate lives for so long. I wanted that too, I admitted, but I didn't know how to break down the wall we had built between us. And now Percy has broken down that wall. Lila smiled bitterly. The irony of fate. Maybe it's for the best, I said cautiously. Not what he did, of course, but the fact that we're finally being honest with each other. Lila nodded, wiping away a tear. You know, I always thought you disapproved of my choices, my husband, my career, my lifestyle. And I thought you were ashamed of me, I replied. Your old-fashioned mother who still lives in the past. Oh, Mom. Lila shook her head. I was never ashamed of you. On the contrary, I was always proud of you. You were so strong, so independent. That's why I chose law. I wanted to be like you. Those words touched me deeply. All these years, I thought Lila had distanced herself from me because she didn't respect my choices. But it turned out that she was trying to emulate me. I'm proud of you too, I said, squeezing her hand. I've always been proud of you. You achieved everything on your own without my help. You became a successful lawyer, built a career. I chose the wrong husband, Lila added bitterly. We all make mistakes in love, I said gently. What matters is what we do after we realize them. Lila looked thoughtfully out the window, where twilight was already enveloping Portland in its gray veil. Do you think it's possible to forgive such betrayal? She asked quietly. What he did, it's not just a lie. It's a violation of everything our relationship was built on. I thought for a long time before answering. Only you can decide, I finally said. But know this, whatever you choose, I will support you. Always. Lila smiled gratefully, and in that moment I saw in her the little girl who once looked at me with the same trust. Somewhere along the way, we lost that connection, but now perhaps there was a chance to restore it. I don't know what to do about Percy's debts, Lila admitted. 86,000. I don't have that kind of money. I do, I said firmly. I can help, but on the condition that Percy goes to the police and testifies against these creditors. Lila looked surprised. You would do that? After what he tried to steal from you? I'm not doing it for him, I explained. I'm doing it for you, and for our safety. The people he owes money to aren't the kind who will just back down. If we pay them now, they may come back later for more. Fred, who had been listening silently to our conversation, nodded in agreement with my assessment. Your mother is right, he said. People like that don't see paying off a debt as the end of the story, but as a sign that they can squeeze even more out of you. But if Percy testifies, they might. Lila didn't finish her sentence, but we all understood what she was thinking. There are witness protection programs, Fred reminded her. And I still have connections in the police force. We can arrange everything properly. Lila was silent for a long time, thinking about what had been said. I need to talk to him, she finally decided. Explain the situation. If he really wants to make amends for what he's done, this is his chance. A wise decision, I agreed. In the meantime, maybe you'll stay here tonight, like old times. Lila smiled, sincerely and warmly for the first time all evening. I'd love to, Mom. I think we both need company tonight. After Fred left, promising to return tomorrow with a more concrete plan of action, Lila and I sat on the porch, watching the last rays of the sun disappear over the horizon. There was silence between us, but not the tense silence that usually accompanied our rare meetings, but a calm, comfortable silence. The silence of two people who were finally beginning to understand each other. You know, Lila said, looking at the darkening sky, maybe something good will come out of all this after all. Maybe, I agreed, covering her hand with mine. Sometimes it takes a crisis to see what's really important. We sat there for a long time, each lost in our own thoughts, connected by an invisible thread of understanding that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. The morning was unexpectedly clear. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating the kitchen where Lila and I were having breakfast. The night at her parents' house seemed to have had a beneficial effect on her. For the first time in a long time, she looked calm, although there was still a trace of anxiety in her eyes. What are you going to do about Percy? I asked, pouring coffee for both of us. Lila stirred her oatmeal thoughtfully, as if the answer might be hidden at the bottom of her bowl. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to file for divorce immediately. Another part, I don't know, maybe it's naive, but I believe people can change. I looked closely at my daughter. Despite her professional toughness, Lila always had a heart that believed in the best in people. Sometimes that was her strength, sometimes her weakness. Percy made his choice, I said softly. Not just once, but many times. Every lie, every debt, every decision to hide the truth. It was a choice. I know, she sighed. It's just hard to believe that the man I lived with for 6 years turned out to be such a stranger. I nodded understandingly. In my career, I had seen many people betrayed by those they considered closest to them. The pain of betrayal is always the same, regardless of age or experience. The decision must be yours, I said, covering her hand with mine. But I want you to know that whatever you choose, I am on your side. Lila smiled gratefully, and for a moment I saw in her the little girl who once trusted me unconditionally. Our moment was interrupted by the doorbell. We both jumped. It was too early for visitors. I got up to answer it and found Fred Donovan on the doorstep, already fully dressed and holding a folder. Sorry for the early visit, Agatha, he said as he entered. But I think we need to discuss a plan of action as soon as possible. I led him into the kitchen, where Lila greeted him with a polite nod. I contacted a few former colleagues, Fred began, taking documents out of his briefcase. And our situation is not as hopeless as it may seem. Duran's people are cruel, but they're not stupid. If we play our cards right, we can solve the problem without taking unnecessary risks. He laid out several papers in front of us. Photographs, police reports, newspaper clippings. It all added up to a picture of Robert Duran's activities in Portland. The police have been trying to nail him for a long time, but they don't have enough evidence. If Percy agrees to testify about his loans and threats, it could be a key element in the case. And how dangerous is that? Lila asked, her professional instincts as a lawyer clearly sharpened. There's always a risk, Fred replied honestly. But we have an advantage. Durant doesn't know we're preparing to take action. He still thinks he's just intimidating another debtor. I studied the photos carefully. Robert Duran looked like a typical successful businessman. Impeccable suit, confident smile, expensive watch. But I've worked with criminals for too long not to notice the cold calculation in his eyes. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, looking up at Fred. A two-pronged approach, he said, pointing to the documents. First, Percy meets with Duran's people and makes the first payment, large enough to show he's serious, but not the full amount. At the same time, we record the meeting and give the recording to the police. After that, Percy gets protection as a key witness. What about the remaining debt? Lila asked. If everything goes according to plan, the remaining debt will be the least of Duran's problems, Fred smiled faintly. But to be on the safe side, we have to be prepared to pay the full amount if something goes wrong. I nodded. The plan was risky, but logical. I had seen similar operations in my practice, and when done right, they usually worked. We need to talk to Percy, I said. Without his consent and cooperation, nothing will work. I already called him, Lila said. He'll be here by 11. Percy arrived at 11 sharp, looking even more exhausted than yesterday. The deep shadows under his eyes spoke of a sleepless night, and the nervous movements of his hands betrayed his anxiety. We gathered in the living room, Lila, Fred, Percy, and me. The atmosphere was tense. Percy sat apart from everyone else, as if physically feeling his alienation from our little group. Fred outlined his plan, not omitting any details about the potential risks. Percy listened silently, only occasionally turning even paler at the mention of open confrontation with Duran. This is suicide, he finally said when Fred finished. You don't know these people. They won't stop until they get to me. That's why the witness protection program is important, Fred explained patiently. It's not a perfect solution, but it's the best one available in your situation. Percy shook his head, his hands trembling. I just can't. What do you suggest? Lila asked sharply. Keep stealing from my mother? Or maybe from me? Percy looked down, unable to meet his wife's gaze. Watching this scene, I made a decision. A decision that had been maturing in me since the moment I caught Percy red-handed. I'll pay your debt, I said, and all heads turned to me. In full. Mom, no! Lila exclaimed. You can't! I can! I raised my hand, stopping her objections. I have enough savings, but I have conditions. Percy looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and hope. What conditions? He asked. First, you move out of Lila's house immediately, I said firmly. Whether you get divorced or not is her decision, but you will no longer be living together. At least for now. Lila looked surprised but didn't object. Percy nodded, accepting the condition. Second, you will undergo treatment for your gambling addiction, a full course with weekly reports to me or Lila. I don't, he began, but I interrupted him. Don't argue. We both know the problem exists. Percy nodded again, giving in. Third, you will find a job, any job, and you will pay me back. Not the entire amount, but a symbolic portion, to remind you of the consequences of your actions. That's fair, he agreed quietly. And finally, I paused. You will never come near my house again without an explicit invitation. Never. Percy looked at me for a long time, then nodded one last time. I agree. Okay, I turned to Fred. How should we organize the payment? We spent the next 2 hours discussing the details of the plan. Fred insisted that a police officer he knew, dressed in plain clothes, be present during the transfer of money, just in case. I agreed, although I understood that this would not provide a complete guarantee of safety. Lila, using her legal knowledge, drew up a document setting out the terms of our agreement with Percy. It had no legal force, but it was morally binding. Percy signed the paper without objection. His eyes showed a mixture of relief and shame. He had escaped danger, but at the cost of losing his family's respect forever. I don't know how to thank you, he said, turning to me. I realize I don't deserve your help. You're right, you don't, I replied without malice, but without warmth either. I'm not doing this for you, but for Lila, and for my own peace of mind. He nodded, accepting my answer. I need to go to the bank, I told Fred. Can you arrange a meeting with Duran's representatives for today? I think so, he said, taking out his phone. We'll arrange a meeting through Percy and tell them we're ready to pay part of the amount now. The plan was put into action with remarkable speed. By 5 o'clock in the evening, Fred, his detective friend who introduced himself as Michael, and I were sitting in a car near a small cafe in the city center. Percy was inside, waiting to meet with the creditors. The money, $86,000 in large bills, was in an inconspicuous bag on my lap. They're here, Michael said, pointing to a black SUV with tinted windows. Two men, both armed, but their weapons are concealed. I tensed, suddenly realizing the danger of the situation. These weren't the usual criminals I dealt with in the past, but an organized group with influence and resources. Maybe I should go instead of Percy, I suggested. I can handle it better. Out of the question, Fred said firmly. You're not at an age to play the hero, Agatha. Besides, they're waiting for him, not you. I reluctantly agreed, understanding his logic. We watched as two men in expensive suits entered the cafe. Through a tiny earpiece, we could hear everything that was happening inside. Percy was equipped with a hidden microphone. Mr. Harper, a cold voice said, I'm glad to see you've decided to take our conversation seriously. I have the money, Percy's voice trembled. The whole amount. There was a pause. The whole amount? 86,000? The other man's voice sounded surprised. Impressive. Mr. Durand will be pleased with your diligence. Here. We heard a rustling sound. Percy must have been handing over the bag of money. Very good, said the second voice, lower and rougher. Mr. Durand appreciates punctuality. Perhaps we can do business with you again in the future. No, Percy replied too quickly. I mean, I'm done with this. No more loans, no more games. As you say, the first man's voice had a smirk to it. But if you change your mind, you know how to find us. A few minutes later, the men left the cafe with the bag of money, got into their SUV, and drove away. Michael immediately contacted his colleagues, who were supposed to follow the car at a safe distance. Everything went smoothly, he said. The recordings are enough to start an investigation, but not enough for an immediate arrest. We need additional evidence for that. So Percy will have to testify after all? I asked. Yes, but now with less risk, Michael explained. Durand thinks the case is closed. That gives us an advantage. We picked up Percy from the cafe, pale but noticeably calmer. The threat to his life had passed, at least for the moment. You did well, Fred told him as we drove back. Now you'll need to meet with the investigator and tell him everything you know about Durand's operations. Percy nodded without looking at us. And then? He asked quietly. Then you'll start a new life, I replied. Separate from Lila, as we agreed, and you'll fulfill the rest of the terms of our agreement. I said it without emotion, as a statement of fact. Even though Percy had avoided the worst consequences of his actions, I didn't feel the slightest bit of sympathy for him. He had betrayed my daughter's trust and tried to rob me, two things I couldn't just forget or forgive. When we returned to my house, Lila was waiting for us on the porch. Her face showed concern, which turned to relief when she saw us all safe and sound. Everything went according to plan, Fred said as he got out of the car. The money has been handed over and the conversation has been recorded. Lila nodded, then turned her gaze to Percy, who was standing uncertainly to one side. I need to talk to you, she said to him, in private. They walked away into the garden, leaving Fred, Michael, and me on the porch. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could tell from their body language that it was a farewell. Lila stood up straight, her gestures restrained and decisive. Percy, on the other hand, seemed broken, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. She's a strong woman, Fred remarked as he watched them. Just like her mother. Stronger, I replied. She'll handle this better than I would have at her age. A few minutes later, Lila returned to us and Percy headed for his car. He took one last look at the house, then got into his car and drove away. We all understood that he was leaving not only this place, but also our lives. Are you okay? I asked Lila when she came up the porch steps. I will be, she replied, and I saw not only pain but determination in her eyes. It had to be done. After Fred and Michael left, having agreed on further action in the Durand case, Lila and I were left alone. Sitting in the living room with cups of tea, we were silent, but it was a comfortable silence. Two people who had gone through an ordeal and emerged with a new understanding of each other. I always underestimated you, Mom, Lila finally said. I thought you were just a stubborn old woman living in the past, but I'm still a stubborn old woman, I finished with a slight smile. Just a little more dangerous than I seem. Lila laughed, sincerely for the first time in 2 days. How much have you done in your career that I don't even know about? She asked with interest. A lot, I admitted. Some stories are better left untold, even to those closest to you. But maybe someday, I'd like to hear them, she said, taking a sip of tea. When you're ready to share. We fell silent again, each lost in our own thoughts. I reflected on how strange life can be sometimes. It took Percy's betrayal to bring us closer to our daughter. Sometimes the most painful events lead to the most unexpected and beneficial results. What are you going to do next? I asked. About the divorce? The house? I'll file for divorce as soon as I sort out the paperwork, Lila replied decisively. I'll sell the house, probably. Too many memories. You could live here while you look for a new place, I suggested, surprised at my own impulsiveness. Lila looked at me with slight surprise, then smiled. That would be nice, Mom. Thank you. At that moment, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Despite all the worries of the last few days, despite the money spent to buy Percy out of his debts, I had gained something much more valuable, a new connection with my daughter, a chance at a relationship I had given up on. That evening, after Lila had fallen asleep in her old room, I sat in Hamish's study, looking at his photograph. You would be proud of her, I said quietly to the picture. She handled this with such dignity. And you would be glad that I finally learned to be a mother, not just a detective. I took the box out of its hiding place and opened it. The jewels sparkled in the light of the desk lamp, but now I looked at them differently, not as relics of the past, but as a legacy that would one day pass to Lila and perhaps to her children, if she decided to have them. Looking at Hamish's medals, I remembered our work together, the cases we had solved together. We had always been a good team, he with his methodical approach and attention to detail, me with my understanding of human psychology. Together, we were practically unbeatable. And now at 74, I had proven that I hadn't lost my touch. I uncovered Percy's deception, protected my home and my family, and found a solution to a dangerous situation. It wasn't like the high-profile cases of the past, but it meant just as much to me. The old guard can still show its class, I whispered, closing the box and returning it to its hiding place. Even if it means defending myself against my own relatives. I pushed the bookcase back into place, feeling my joints ache from the effort. Age was taking its toll, but my spirit remained unbroken. Life has taught me one important truth. Sometimes you have to destroy relationships to protect what is truly important. Percy was gone from our lives, and that was the right thing. Some betrayals cannot be forgiven, some wounds never heal completely. But from the ruins of old relationships, new ones can grow, stronger and more honest. Returning to the bedroom, I walked past Lila's room and quietly opened the door to make sure she was okay. She was sleeping peacefully, curled up under the covers, just like when she was a child. I smiled and quietly closed the door. Tomorrow, a new chapter in our lives would begin, without Percy, but with a new bond between us. And I was ready for that future, whatever it might be.